What happened to the astronaut who was lost in space for 311 lonely days? After ringing in both Christmas Day and New Year in outer space, Sergei began to wonder if he'd ever get back down to Earth. While the company of his fellow cosmonaut Commander Volkov was nice, the problem was that the longer Sergei remained in space, the more strapped for cash Russia became. With his future, and even survival, growing increasingly uncertain, Sergei could do nothing but continue waiting and wishing on every passing star that good news would come soon. Sergei Krikalev was born on August 27, 1958, in the city of Leningrad, known as St. Petersburg today. As a young boy, Sergei was all too aware of the intense space race between the Soviet Union and the USA. An outgrowth of the mid-20th century cold conflict, the space race was a series of competitive technological showcases, with each side aiming to prove superiority in spaceflight. As the years went by, Sergei continued to keep his sights set on the stars in his own race for space, and gained a degree in mechanical engineering in 1981 from the Leningrad Mechanical Institute. After graduating, Sergei found work with the NPO Energia, the Russian industrial organization responsible for manned spaceflight activities for the Soviet space program. In his early years there, Sergei tested spaceflight equipment and worked as part of ground control for space missions. Sergei played a key role among the ground control team during an in-orbit rescue mission of the Salyut 7 space station after it failed in 1985 and was able to remotely guide repairs of the station's onboard control system. After these successes, Sergei was selected for cosmonaut training. Sergei finally earned his cosmonaut wings in 1986. Sergei was as a cosmonaut rather than an astronaut. It's because, technically, cosmonauts are people specifically trained by the Russian Space Agency, and the word literally means universe sailor. In early 1988, Sergei began training for his first long-duration spaceflight aboard the Mir space station which, at the time, was the largest artificial space satellite in orbit. The overall objective for Mir was to research how the human body reacted to space travel, as well as observational sciences. It was finally Sergei's turn to blast off to Mir on the Soyuz TM-7 expedition, a joint mission involving both French and Soviet space venturers. The mission came to an end 151 days later on April 27, 1989. With a relatively smooth operation under his belt, Sergei found himself desperate to get back up there, to infinity and beyond. But, unbeknownst to Sergei, his next trip would leave him desperate to get back to Earth. By December 1990, Sergei was already preparing for his second spaceflight as part of the crew for the Soyuz TM-12 mission. On May 18, 1991, Sergei arrived at the Baikonur Cosmodrome, which was famous for being the world's first spaceport to launch rockets into space. Alongside him was Anatoly Artsebarksy, an experienced Ukrainian commander, and Helen Sharman, the first British astronaut. It was also the site from which Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to travel into space on April 12, 1961. While Sergei's mission was set to be rather routine, as far as flying into space can be, I guess, unbeknownst to him, in 311 days, he was going to find himself listed alongside Baikonur's most historic travelers. As the spacecraft carrying him, Anatoly, and Helen approached Mir after a 2-day trek to the station, the targeting system failed, meaning that Sergei had to dock their rocket manually. Doing this manually is a tough affair and just one wrong move can be fatal. Sergei managed to dock the crew safely. Mir could accommodate up to 6 people, but usually, just 3 cosmonauts lived there at once because it was so cramped. While being in space certainly has its wonders, life on Mir wasn't exactly a glamorous affair. Much like the fictional spaceship, the Millennium Falcon, Mir was often thought of as simultaneously a masterpiece of modern engineering and a complete and utter piece of trash. Not only was this frustrating for the astronauts as they went about their day's work, but it was also a blinking reminder of just how much they had to rely on this faulty technology to breathe and stay pressurized. In other words, to survive. Sergei had an awesome crew around him, including his space buddies Anatoly and Helen, as well as 2 other cosmonauts who had been on Mir since December 1990. On May 26, 1991, Helen and 2 of the other cosmonauts completed their missions and headed back to Earth, leaving Sergei and Anatoly to their own mission, maintaining and repairing the station. Sergei's mission was planned to end in October 1991, so he still had 5 whole months left on Mir, and there was plenty of work to do. In August, not far from their mission's end date, everything changed. From his intergalactic point of view, Sergei was able to take a whistle-stop tour through the wonders of the world in just an hour and a half as Mir circled Earth, from the pyramids of Giza to the Great Barrier Reef, to the Grand Canyon. What he couldn't see were the tanks rolling through Moscow's Red Square, which signaled the collapse of the nation he called home. Sergei worried constantly about his family and friends as they experienced the political unrest on the ground. Sergei kept up with the unfolding events in the USSR as best he could, mainly being kept informed by his wife Yelena, who worked in mission control. Sergei was understandably confused over what was going on, wondering exactly what all this meant for the space program and his mission. Remember the Baikonur Cosmodrome, where Sergei took off from? Well, that now belonged to the new government of the Republic of Kazakhstan, and they weren't too keen on sharing. Kazakhstan's government tried to charge astronomical fees for use of the space complex, and Russia, strapped for money due to the dissolution of the USSR, needed a solution fast. To appease this new Kazakh government, the Soviet Space Program Agency, whose headquarters were in Moscow, agreed for a spot on the next shuttle to Mir to be given to a Kazakhstani cosmonaut. This was a big problem for Sergei, as the inclusion of Toktar Bakirov, the Kazakh cosmonaut, meant that the planned flight engineer replacement, Alexander Kaleri, was bumped from the mission. The team of 3 new cosmonauts joined the Mir crew on October 4, led by Commander Alexander Volkov, who Sergei already knew from his first time on Mir. By December 26 of that year, the Soviet Union had completely broken apart into 15 different republics, with Gorbachev resigning. After ringing in both Christmas Day and New Year in outer space, Sergei began to wonder if he'd ever get back down to Earth. While the company of his fellow cosmonaut Commander Volkov was nice, the problem was that the longer Sergei remained in space, the more strapped for cash Russia became. With his future, and even survival, growing increasingly uncertain, Sergei could do nothing but continue waiting and wishing on every passing star that good news would come soon. Even in the 90s it was known that long-haul space stayers like Sergei faced some serious health risks. For one thing, being in a closer proximity to the Sun than on Earth left Sergei exposed to radiation from highly energetic solar particles, vastly increasing the risk of developing cataracts and even cancer. There was a Soyuz capsule on board Mir, specifically designed for returning to Earth in an emergency. But here's the problem. Sergei was the only cosmonaut left on Mir with the overall technical know-how to keep things running. If he did decide to leave, it could mean the end of the space station, forever. Despite the physical and mental toll that his space stay was taking on him, Sergei's sheer determination and commitment to his mission outshone even the brightest star. In March 1992, Germany paid $24 million, in a stroke of political bargaining with Russia, for Klaus-Dietrich Flotte to travel to Mir, becoming the first German astronaut in space. This meant that Russia could finally afford a replacement for Sergei, who by this time, had spent a total of 10 months orbiting Earth, having circled the planet around 5,000 times. Sergei could finally turn his mind to getting his feet back on solid ground and reuniting with his wife and daughter. On March 17, 1992, the Soyuz TM-14 crew, including Alexander and Klaus, the German, whose $24 million travel fare had paid for Sergei's trip home, launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome towards Mir. A week after the new crew arrived, Sergei was finally able to make his way back down to Earth alongside Klaus and his buddy, Commander Volkov. On March 25, 1992, the Soyuz rocket landed at Baikonur. As the doors opened, a small crowd flocked around the landed rocket as a dizzy spaceman as pale as flour emerged. After 10 months of muscle atrophy, several men had to help him stand against Earth's gravity and supported him as he placed his feet on the ground, inhaling breaths of fresh atmospheric air for the first time in 311 days. Arriving in a much-changed Russia, Sergei must have felt like quite the alien. Even his hometown had changed its name while he was up in space, from Leningrad to St. Petersburg. He continued his celestial career as a cosmonaut and was back above the sky just under 2 years after returning home. In fact, Sergei took part in a further 4 missions between 1994 and 2005 and made space history books again on November 2, 2000. When he was a part of the crew who embarked on the first long-duration expedition to the International Space Station.